Thank you all for joining us. We can go ahead and start off today, and welcome back. We have quite a bit of content that we want to cover today, so if you have questions, please send them to us via the chat function. Is everyone familiar with the chat function? It's the button that says chat, and you can click on the everyone option and type in your question. Max will help me to organize those and respond accordingly, but we'll also have time hopefully at the end to do some questions. And we also have Bobby Vassar joining us again, Robin Jenkins, and I'm not sure, is Jesse on? Maybe not. Okay, but we have several of us on the Bobby and Robin, please feel free to chime in with experiences, and if others have experiences too that relate to some of the content, please feel free to chime in anytime regarding those experiences to sort of help make this a more rich and complete overview of what it's like to be engaging in the legislative process. All right. So today we're going to go over legislative processes, which includes just sort of in theory what happens, how things get on the agenda, and also the success of how bills become laws and things like that. Then we'll go over some avenues that we can become engaged in legislative processes, including things like developing research briefs or briefings, and then we'll go over the needs assessment results that we have so far. Basically, I keep alluding to the results, or sorry, the needs assessments that I've been doing with congressional offices. And we're about to have the final round of needs assessments where I'll basically ask, I'll say, these are the things that we talked about. Let's sort of concretize what it is that you want from us in our involvement. And so that's how we'll spend the last part of our time, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get to that, and that's why I want to try and speed through some of these slides. And just note that on many of these slides I have actually, let me just show you an example. So here's the second content slide. You'll see things that are underlined in dark blue are actually links, and so I sent the slides out around on Basecamp. You can these are basically references for you guys to be able to find more information, because it's just not possible for me to cover everything in detail here today. Okay, so starting out on slide 3, the legislative agenda. This is a lot of this content is coming from Kingdon. It's a famous book that sort of describes research on how it was this extensive study that tried to understand how in the U.S. things become part of the legislative agenda. These are things that we're actually considering, and how is it that alternatives to existing policies are considered. And so in general, we know that the agenda can be affected by a lot of different circumstances, including crises or prominent events. So it's not always very linear. And it can also depend on things that are political processes like election results and national mood. And national mood can affect election results. And so there are these different factors that go into sort of creating what is it that we're even discussing related to policy right now. And it's worth acknowledging that the media has a sort of short attention span, because people end up getting tired of the same content over and over again. So the media has to keep us moving along, and that sort of contributes to the agenda as well, that it's ever changing and dynamic, and part of it is about what we're focusing on as a society, and part of how things become part of the agenda is that problems get quantified, and there's some reasonable potential solutions out there that we might consider. And so in the context of our work right now on the agenda is juvenile justice reform. This provides a huge opportunity for involvement in those things. And maybe yesterday's agenda was was pre-K for everyone. Not that that's not still somewhere on the agenda, it's just not quite as prominent on the agenda. Where alternatives is what Kingdon describes as a range of possible solutions. These are things that we'd like to be more rationally considered, but in reality, there's a lot of different things that go into deciding whether one alternative is acceptable over a different alternative. And some of that we discussed last week. So it's not always realistic to do a major rehaul over something. And so oftentimes policies focus on small incremental steps and changes. And a lot of what is necessary for promoting an alternative would be consensus building, persuasion and bargaining. This is where short, snappy phrases can be quoted and can have a lot of influence in the legislative arena, and people who are political champions might use their influence to not just support, but also to encourage additional support for certain alternatives or solutions. And opportunistic is really a great way to frame how you might be involved in the legislative arena, because Kingdon describes this policy window where the agenda aligns with possible solutions and alternatives, and if the stars are aligning, you have to take advantage of that opportunity. And if you don't take advantage of it very quickly, the stars don't stay aligned for that long. And so these are just very brief opportunity periods. Kingdon, this particular version, has an addendum that says the Affordable Care Act was a huge policy window where there was just the right political climate, and that created change. And so advocates can also play a role in those and pushing their solutions, or even being a bit more flexible whenever there's a realistic opportunity for change. So in the legislative arena, you have different groups that are responsible for legislative objectives, including committees where there's pretty precise jurisdictional boundaries. And here I have provided links for the lists of committees in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And even within committees, you have subcommittees. So one of the subcommittees we've been working with is the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. Still got a lot of breadth in what they can cover, but that is who's covering things like juvenile justice reform. And also another group that would be responsible for considering legislative objectives would be things like caucuses. Now, one caucus that we have an involvement with, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little background noise. You can put 714, if you can put your mic on mute, that would be really helpful. 343 4300. Okay. Well, I hope that's not bothering other people. With caucuses, one of the examples that we're currently working with is the Crime Prevention and Youth Development Caucus. They can be partisan, or they can be based on a specific interest group, like the one I just described. And so I agree. Can 714-34-34300 please mute your microphone?
You can move the cursor into the screen, and then the menu will pop out that says mute.
Oh, I think we've come to a resolution. Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. So moving on, interest groups include things that are largely advocates. This can also be represented by lobbyists, but they basically are representing a unified external voice outside of the legislative arena, but they really get their power in being able to convince government entities that they're representing a large group of voters. And then you have these different ideas of what constitutes a bipartisan sort of arrangement. which really segues into these unwritten rules and etiquette. And I'd love it if Bobby could say a little bit about this, but basically there are these partisan norms that that cause some consternation around what are the unwritten rules of order. And some of that is, you know, did someone propose it first and now you have a bill that's too similar that can cause animosity? Or is someone, for example, making non-noticed actions in the middle of the night for pending legislation? And or even, you know, having a bipartisan practice would really mean that you have to have both parties involved at some degree of conversation about the legislation. And that has even come into play with our congressional briefings, where we always try to engage both sides of the aisle, but not if we haven't been able to engage both sides of the aisle, it suddenly looks like a partisan briefing. It's just part of the norms is that we have to try and involve both sides of the aisle. So, Bobby, do you want to say anything more about sorts of things that are norms that we might be learning and adapting to?
Well, there are lots of them. I think the one you're pointing to is one of the basic clues here that you have to always have in the back of your mind, that this is a partisan environment, and partisanship is the rule, the norm, that the majority party has a point to make, the minority party has a point to make from a party perspective. And so some of the stuff that you see is based on that there's strategy in the background where you don't want the other side to necessarily know what your approach is going to be in pursuing or defending against legislative positions, bills, and so there is maneuvering around that. So you'll see partisan briefings, particularly on legislative items, where just one side is expected to attend, and it's even considered really, if someone from the other party tried to attend, even though it's in the public arena and what have you, that's not great. That's not a good thing to do. And you're always looking at issues of turf and credit, as Taylor has pointed out here. These folks want to let their constituents know that they're working on their behalf, and they want to show what their accomplishments are. They want to take personal credit for it. You can't pass legislation unless in the House, for example, you have at least 218 people that agree as a majority, but each one wants to take credit for moving that legislation. And then when you expand that to the fact that you've got a Senate and you got to have both House and Senate pass the same bill before it can become law, and you get a struggle over whose bill is it? Is the Senate version adopted or the House version adopted? And it doesn't amount to a whole lot in a practical legislative sense, but in a real world partisan credit, turf, and all of those kinds of things, which party is associated with what, those things make a lot of difference, and you want to always be aware that it's the unforeseen or unseen, rather, force there. It's kind of the dark matter of the political scene that you want to be aware is always having an impact.
Mm-hmm. And I think the point, thank you so much, Bobby. I think the point of bringing these up is that you're not always going to know what the unwritten rules are, but you're going to have to be respectful that that's the way it is. This is an arena where we're coming into it, and we're not able to change everything. We kind of have to be adaptive to the existing norms. And there will be norms that we have to learn along the way, even ones that we're not pointing out here that maybe I don't even know of, or maybe ones that we're forgetting. But just to be adaptive to these partisan rules. So moving us along to the next.
Could I make a comment, please?
Sure.
Bobby, you have a great point. The legislator who belong to certain party would be, in my view, would be more open to discuss with us the problem they're facing. If we meet with them with one party and then meet with another party separately, so that they'll be open to discussion rather than meeting both at one time. And we could be fair and speak to both and trying to help them both.
Yeah, I think that's correct. There are bipartisan bills and approaches, but you can't really assume that that's what the posture of the members might be. You're better off starting with the assumption that there may be different perspectives on legislation and try to sort that out ahead of time rather than believing just because it's science or something that seems an inevitable truth that everybody has the same view toward it.
I see. So the first approach is to meet with both parties, and then later on, if necessary, we will speak to individuals.
And that is something that
Yes.
we're going to be doing here, is that we're meeting with individual offices. And like Bobby's pointing out, individual offices may have different perspectives about it. And that's maybe even within political parties. You know, you might have one office who has a different perception of specific legislation that's in the committee or on the floor. And so, yes, I think that that's a good point, is to sort of figure out how individual offices align, and then seeing where you might help those offices, and if it's possible, if there might be overlap. That's something that we're not quite getting to, is the latter stage. But exactly what you're saying, David, is that we'll be meeting with individual offices, not trying to cross over political parties too much.
I understand. We were focusing on specific subcommittee first to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right. So the next slide, we have the legislative process, which I've provided some links to read more information. And if you ever want to find out information about an existing bill, the Library of Congress has a database called Thomas that you can look up who's the co-sponsor on specific legislation, what actions have been taken, is it still in committee or is it at one of these other steps? And basically, if the committee doesn't act on a bill, it's the same thing as killing the bill. It just will die and not be heard from again. But and then later on, actions include subcommittee reviews, which might include things like hearings and testimonies, the written report in sorry, I'm blanking on which. There is a written report that will describe the impact on existing laws, and then floor action, either in the House or
committee report.
Yes, the committee report, the committee action to report a bill, or publication of a written report, number 6. And basically, each of these processes have to happen in both the Senate and the House, and so it might start in the House, but they have different calendars of whether or not a bill will come up chronologically. So the Senate's a bit more simple. They only have one legislative calendar, but the House has many calendars, which sort of allows the Speaker and the Majority Leader to determine which bills come up. And so if it passes, then it would be referred to the other chamber. If it's in the House, it goes to the Senate, and it goes through those same processes. And so if it passes both chambers, then it might have to go to a conference committee to reconcile the differences, so that, if the Senate marked it up a bit and it's changed, now the House has to see if they agree with those and come to some sort of reconciliation. And if it makes it through all those steps, then the president can either sign or veto, or they could do no action. And if it's while Congress is in session, it would automatically become law. If the president doesn't do anything while the Congress is in recess, then it's a pocket veto. And of course, 2/3 majority is required to override a veto. And so the next slide really shows you, this is a graph that shows you where bills go to die. It's sort of a morbid way of describing it, but basically, there's lots of legislation that gets proposed and it goes to committee, but the majority of the bills that don't pass, they die in the committee, so they don't become part of the committee's particular agenda. And only 4% of bills became law in between 2007 2009. It's a pretty small rate of success, but even still, that was quite a number of bills. And the last thing that you might want to know about is hotlining is a way that the Senate can sort of speed the process along, but it requires unanimous consent. So basically, if all of the senators agree, then it can go on to the House. But if there's one person who doesn't agree, then they have to do a full process. And this came up recently with JJDPA reauthorization. It was hotline and it didn't pass because one office voted no. It doesn't allow for debate or amendments. It's just supposed to be really speeding up the process. Does anybody else have any comments or experience on?
Yeah, on the hotlining, because we're on that, Taylor, let me say this, Bobby, that you should understand that it's more of a process of someone failing to disagree as opposed to everybody agreeing. People don't get together and agree, but it's put out there, and if no disagreement, then it can be hotline. If there is any one member who disagrees, it can't be. And just looking at the process here, what you've set out is the general process that a bill may go through, but of course, bills get voted on in all kinds of ways. It can go directly to the floor with no consideration by committees or anything else if the membership agrees to that. So you can, by agreement, waiver, lots of other devices, get legislation considered in ways that are not set out here, but that's the general process through which a bill may go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I ask a question. What is the chamber? This is an ignorance on my part.
A chamber is either the House or the Senate. So by committees, there's different committees in either the House or the Senate. And so within the House, there might be a committee that has jurisdiction over a bill, and that's where a bill is most likely to die because the committee doesn't discuss it or et cetera, doesn't put it on their calendar.
I see. Thank you.
Okay, so moving us along, how we can get engaged. We can get engaged, and Bobby Vassar is actually the person who made it very clear to me that we can get engaged at a wide range of areas during the legislative process, and that's I think was a misconception for me was, okay, we can get involved in something before it's written, right? And we can inform how legislation is written. While that's true, there's a lot of other opportunities as well, including whenever it's being considered in the committee, if they need expert testimony, and even after it becomes law, there's implementation of a law, such as Every Student Succeeds Act. This is already becoming law, but they're still working on defining the regulations and determining the appropriations to implement that law. And so the different avenues for action might include things like policy briefs, congressional briefings, expert testimony, writing model legislation, and outreach and advocacy. So I'm going to try and go through these kind of quickly. Again, the underlined materials here are resources that you can click on and read at your own time and your own pace. So with a policy brief, it's important to start out with your target audience, figure out what is feasible for the target audience, and how to frame the issue. Policy briefs are generally about 1 to 2 pages. Always include a reference list. The title is way more important than we might think it is, just because that's the first thing someone's going to read. And if it doesn't have a short, catchy title that grabs their attention, they're probably not going to read it. It needs to make sure that it's appealing and it's going to resonate with them. And the layout is really critical as well. You can use things like bullets and graphs to highlight key points, and making clear points that have snappy, salient statements that can be quoted for persuasive. This is part of if a congressperson is going to use any information from your brief, what is something that they can use for persuading and being a political champion on ideas coming from that brief. And so it also needs to be action-oriented with viable recommendations, analysis-driven where you're presenting facts and evidence. Surprising to me is the number of questions I've gotten on just purely quantifying the problems within juvenile justice. It's like, okay, well, what is the magnitude of the problem of solitary confinement for juveniles? And if they don't have a sense that it's a real problem, then why would we address it? And so quantifying the problem is a particularly salient part of the policy brief in my mind. And also providing multiple reputable resources so that people don't think that this is just coming from you and your perspective, but this is something that is objective, and there are multiple organizations that are saying X, Y, and Z. And I provided a couple of examples that you might refer to, which was requested during the last meeting. For congressional briefings, this is something that I will shamelessly say our organization has done a pretty good job at. We have hosted multiple congressional briefings. Neil Wallman gets all the credit for really initiating relationships where we've identified congressional sponsors. It requires people who are in congressional offices to help reserve a room. He will help line up speakers and confirm people who can speak on a range of topics. And then, of course, if you don't have an audience, then what's the point? You have to announce and advertise it. One of the difficulties that we have had is, like I had alluded to before, is if you have one speaker from one party and don't confirm a speaker from a different party, then now begins to look like a partisan briefing. And that's something that we want to be cautious about. We want to make sure that it's attracting audiences from both sides of the aisle. And basically it's just a way of presenting things in a very simple way, and typically provides handouts and PowerPoints. You can find plenty of examples on our website where we've broken up those into about 10-minute speaker segments. So the next thing, and just to be frank, I feel like I'm probably less familiar with this as an option, but expert testimony is something that is done often during the subcommittee process when they are considering a bill. It could be, so the call for testimony is supposed to be a public document. Whether or not that's disseminated widely is something that may vary between efforts. But whenever you're reviewing a call for testimony, it's important to really consider, are you talking to a bipartisan audience, a specific committee? What is the event detail? And are there participation rules? So like things that would constrain your participation, and what do you need to do in terms of providing a written testimony, and will you be one among multiple witnesses? If you have multiple witnesses, that's a lot easier to cover the territory on an issue. Advocates can really triangulate and make sure that they're aligning their statements on a particular position. I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of background noise from that phone number again, 713. Thank you. And so make sure that if you do want to be part of an expert testimony, that you do a timely response that makes sure that increases your likelihood of being selected. Always cite and attach relevant publications and involve the press in publicizing this expert testimony. Another way that you might get involved is through model legislation. One of the offices that I've met with, Crystal Williams is a staffer for Representative Jackson Lee, and she is very enthusiastic about translating research into legislation regarding juvenile justice and crime prevention. However, she's noted that, you know, there's so many resources that provide recommendations, but to bridge the divide a little bit more would be to go one more step beyond just providing a list of recommendations, but to actually draft legislative language, which would include things that are rules or regulation. You can start by either assessing or modifying existing legislation, or new drafted legislation new legislation could be drafted. And so again, with the underlined materials here, these are resources where you can get more information about how to draft legislation. There's several drafting manuals. And I'll give Brian Bumbarger the credit for connecting us with these wonderful resources. And there are examples here at the bottom of model legislation. So the last area that we can be involved, and I want to underscore that when scientists aren't involved in advocacy, they're essentially allowing special interest groups to have the microphone and sort of full access to the megaphone, because if your voice isn't heard, someone else's voice will be heard. And so scientists in advocacy that has contentious implications for some groups, but the building consensus seems to be that if scientists can be involved in a nonpartisan sort of objective way of at least disseminating information about research, that this is a way that we can counteract interest groups that might have something that's not, you know, industries that are not necessarily advocating for the best interest of citizens, but for the best interest of their group. And so we can become part of advocacy groups that represent a segment of voters. We can engage in things like media advocacy, which might be like op-eds or social media, writing your representative. And I put education in air quotes because oftentimes that seems to make people feel more comfortable with the word advocacy. Advocacy being one of those words where there's a slippery slope. There's a line drawn in the sand, and most people don't know where that line is, but education seems to be a little bit less contentious. I can clearly provide you with information, and that is not lobbying, that is just purely providing information. And so to elaborate more on these details, I'll describe more next week about what the restrictions are on lobbying for people who are engaged in governmental grants, nonprofit organizations, etc. So hopefully, if that's of interest to you, you can tune in next week. So with any of these avenues, always cite and provide resources. Legislators don't have time to go track down key documents, and they need to provide sources. So if you want your input to be of use, it has to really be anchored by things that they can cite. Also, respect legislative staffers. We talked about this last week, but realistically, we won't be working face-to-face with legislators. You're more than likely going to work with staff who shape the opinions of their congresspersons. And also be prepared with materials. Sticking to a key message is probably one of the hardest things to do because there's so much that we want to share, right? But if we overload people with too much information, then it can sort of lose its effectiveness. If you stick to a key message, responding to a very precise request for information or whatnot, that can really help to move along. Your message has to be not too dispersed, because otherwise it's just going to be watered down and hard for anyone to act on. Next, also don't be surprised if you're asked about another issue. Like we said, at the policy arena, the agenda is ever changing, and even though these needs assessments that we're doing with congressional offices are intended to help us understand how we can play a role, that doesn't mean that their needs might not change in just a few days. It really just depends. And so if something like a Sandy Hook incident happens again, you're bound to see the agenda change very quickly. And finally, express gratitude. I think that this goes without saying. You just say thank you at the end of a meeting and just be very appreciative for their time, but also follow up with a thank you note. Okay, so before I move on to the needs assessment results, I feel like I talked really quickly. I can take a couple of questions before we move on.
Before people come in with questions, I just want to acknowledge that there were some good points raised on the group chat. In particular, I just want to call out a couple, but everyone is of course welcome to look at what was said. In particular, Robin brought up a good point, which is involvement in general can happen both on the Hill, but also locally in the district, and I think that is key, particularly for those who might not be able to travel to the event, but this work is kind of relevant locally for you or within your state. That's definitely something to keep in mind. And then also kind of on the kind of topic of hotlining, there's some useful comments there about what that looks like in the House and the Senate. So if that was a topic you're interested in, please feel free to look at that. All right, Taylor, you want to take some questions?
Yeah, thank you.
One more question.
Sure.
Are we able to suggest a question that hasn't been considered by Congress?
I'm sorry.
Or are we just answering their questions in this participation in the process? Are we able to raise a question that they haven't considered that might be important to address the issues they're confronted?
I think that there is always that possibility of doing that, of raising questions if you have personal relationships with offices. With this particular effort, we're striving to really figure out what is it that the congressional offices need so that we can start where they are. I think that understanding the context of the existing agenda, that it's unlikely that we're going to be able to sort of change the agenda by just having a handful of researchers involved and saying that this is something I think you should consider. That doesn't mean that that's not something that you might not get involved with in an advocacy sort of way, but in this particular effort, we'll probably be focused more on addressing their questions. Let's start with the legislative offices and understand what they need from us.
One of my thought is in answering their question that they're seeking, we could perhaps raise an angle that they haven't thought about. So that might be one way to help them.
Mm-hmm.
That's another way to raise a question, an issue that they haven't considered. I think that that's logical. Okay, you answered my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Great. If anyone else has any other questions, please feel free, while Taylor is talking about the needs assessment work, to just send a message to everyone on the chat, or you can send one directly to me as well. All right, Taylor.
Thank you. All right, so with the needs assessments that we've been doing, really getting to know what is it that the congressional offices are working on and what is it that they predict as areas we might be able to support their work in the coming months. And so I sort of asked questions about their current efforts, and if they had sort of a dream team of prevention scientists that could help them with their work, what would that look like? What sorts of information are they looking for? And so we've got several themes, and I've got 2 slides. So this is the first slide of the first needs assessment results. Not surprisingly, conservative offices were often interested in how we can support implementation in communities where communities were really had the driver's seat. You know, we're not going to go in as a federal mandates and say this is what you should be doing, but instead, how can we support the work that you want to do? If you are striving to achieve reductions in crime by doing disciplinary practices, and that's what you want to do, how can we support that? And so they wanted to better understand examples of communities that had successfully built capacity and the sorts of tools that would be useful for juvenile justice reform at the local level, and showcasing communities with those efforts. Another theme was regarding just basic education and outreach. And so there were a couple of offices that noted that there could be more education on things like neuroscience, you know, the implications for juvenile justice. If we're trying juveniles as adults, but their brains aren't fully developed, what implications does that have? And so that was one briefing topic that came out. Other topics came out like having better showcases of successes in communities, and also how we might be able to work with advocacy groups, because they really acknowledge the fact that groups like law enforcement historically have had a huge influence on our legislation and those processes. And so if we could get something like the Right on Crime group to acknowledge research-based practices as a way to not just accomplish, you know, their value-oriented goals of accountability, but also being, you know, using research in a way that will help to advance safer communities, that would go a long way in building political support for prevention science ideas. And third, there was a request to centralize resources that had been vetted and non-biased. And so that's part of what, when you guys are responding to rapid requests, I'm archiving these documents, and eventually we're hoping to get those on the website so that they're attainable by congressional offices we're working with, or even those outside those that we're working with. The next theme was regarding the use of evidence for physical and mental health practices. And so in general, they acknowledged that there were, we know that there are things about mental health and juveniles, but how do you actually use that in practice so that we can prevent crime and reduce recidivism and things like that? And so one topic that came up were drug courts or other specialized courts. Another topic included law enforcement practices. So it seemed like that might align with things like knowing how to respond to a youth in crisis for mental health challenges, or even law enforcement within schools. Another implication was, I guess something I've already alluded to, was regarding neurocognitive development and how that has implications for whether or not we're trying people as adults or juveniles. The other themes we've noticed include things like investment mechanisms for prevention. There's a huge interest in understanding how we can use research in a way that saves taxpayer dollars and improves certain social costs like crime. And so there was sort of a vague interest in how that might be of benefit to championing these ideas. And also one office in particular talked about the need for enhancing accountability of block grant programs. And she said this broadly, but we talked about it in the context of Juvenile Accountability Block Grant Program, also known as JBIG. And, you know, starting with one particular block grant program might help us to figure out mechanisms for accountability. And while accountability can be sort of a dirty word in some circles, I think in this context, we could really think about how we frame it in terms of building data systems and communities that allow for ongoing evaluation and capacity building, continuous quality improvement, and how those systems can be informing federal processes, including their data systems, which is actually the last bullet as well. Disciplinary practices in schools came up, especially in regards to the Every Student Succeeds Act. Conditions for incarcerated juveniles, this came up, like I said before. People wanted to know what is the actual magnitude of some of these conditions, you know, like shackling and being housed in the same prison as adults and things like that. What are, you know, is it a real problem? Because these offices couldn't even get their hands on actual percentages of what the magnitude of the problem was. Community-based alternatives to incarceration was something that came up in several offices, just wanting to know about best practices that had been happening in communities, how that might inform federal efforts, and then also reintegration following incarceration. So not just preventing incarceration in the first place or doing something as an alternative to incarceration, but if a youth is incarcerated or an adult is incarcerated, what can we do to reintegrate them into society? And the last bullet is about data infrastructure, where there were a wide range of themes here, where there were definitely implications for effective screening programs. That I think ties really well to the bullet previously about drug courts, because we need these screening programs for a lot of these things that are coming up. But then also having infrastructure at the federal level so that we can know things like what are the percentages of youth who are in solitary confinement. We don't have good data systems that are being reported out at a federal level. And third, concerns regarding confidentiality. So this came up in one particular meeting where I thought, you know, we were sort of connecting and talked about how, yes, we need to have better systems in place for building capacity for improving systems, improving programs that are working with juveniles. And I said something about data infrastructure so that there could be better data collected across systems. And she paused and was really concerned because in her experience as a previous juvenile defender, she knows that too much access to data can exacerbate the black box problem, where juveniles are not going to be eligible for the same opportunities just because maybe their caseworker is telling their teacher that they were arrested for something, and now their teacher is going to, there's the stigma that decreases opportunities for youth who have had incidences in their background. So before I move on, what questions do you guys have for me in terms of these conversations?
Hi, Taylor. This is Aisha. Sorry, my internet kept going in and out, so I haven't been able to log on much earlier. I was a little late. I have a couple quick questions. So one of the issues related to sort of neurobiology is there's lots of evidence now that in trying to reorient adolescents or juveniles to have new behaviors and adopt new values, if you will. Really, the idea is to give them immediate rewards rather than long-term rewards. So on the one hand, we need to understand, you know, how brain development impacts impulsivity, etc. But there's also the rehabilitation side of this. So perhaps in trying to reform the juvenile justice system, it can also be much more sort of a, you know, follow the biology method, where the structure to reinforce or reward certain behaviors should also be based on what we know about the biology of these systems. Mm-hmm. So potentially that would be an interesting other area to also explore with Congressional, because if money goes to these types of re-education and rehabilitation systems or prevention mechanisms, not just at the tail end after, you know, after a criminal behavior has happened, but also in maybe helping the youth change the environment in which they're in, the reward systems in which they're in. And this is not just at the level of the family, but it's also a societal problem. So something maybe at the level of local, of towns and through communities that can be done to try and re-guide these individuals, getting funds for that maybe. So is that something that would be useful to discuss or have that topic?
I think so. I think that the things that you're describing right now really align with some of the interests of offices in the House Judiciary Committee on the Subcommittee for Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. I think that the neuroscience piece is something that there seems to be a need for broad-based education, and I believe you've been in those conversations for the rapid response request to provide information about the science behind neurobiology and whether or not we should even be considering juveniles as, what are the ethical ramifications even of considering someone who's a juvenile in adult court and treating them in the same way. And I think that that's a great point, that it does have implications for reintegration or helping to rehabilitate youth, or so implications in that way. And I think that that's something that could definitely be part of your conversation with someone like the key staffer for the
right. In other words, there's not a one solution for all incarcerated individuals to get rehabilitated. The pattern of, behavior modification is going to be, the model for that is going to have to be different because they don't process reward the same way.
Right.
So Taylor, this is Robin. Can I add a comment?
Sure, please.
I love this whole conversation around broadening exposure to the epigenetics and the neurological potential that can come from properly engineered systems for these kids. The slippery slope in that conversation is for those who have been elected and sent to Washington or even to your state capitol on a sort of accountability platform. They get a little, the hair on their neck rises when they start talking about rewarding kids who have done bad things. And so part of wrapping this in a wrapper that makes sense of them is, how do you teach providers and families and communities reward systems that do what we would like to do in the format of rehabilitation or retraining, while still holding kids accountable for the behavior that got them referred to the system to begin with, or any subtle or overt mistakes they make while they're in treatment. And so district attorneys and police folk often take the harsher line of, let's let them do their penalties first, and then we'll do all this other stuff around rehabilitation and treatment. So there's an art form to this in terms of balancing the whole public safety, accountability, and responsibility conversation with sort of this neurological and biological face of it. And I think we're all struggling with it. So anybody on this call that has suggestions for better ways to do that, this group would be a great place to seed that conversation and to see what we can come up with.
Yeah, and I would like to thank you. This is a very good point, and I also want to add that I should have been more precise in my language. We have sort of eliminated the word reward in that general sense and replaced it with the word reinforcement. I should have used the word reinforcement. So more immediate reinforcement, whether that is a positive. And I wasn't talking about rewarding the child per se, but you're right, absolutely. The system needs to be immediately benefiting from policies that seem to be reducing these things rather than a long term. Yes, thank you.
You all are pointing to the critical notion of how important our language is. And I love that you've reframed reward to reinforcement, because as psychologists, that kind of means the same thing. but to a general audience, it really doesn't. And that's a definitely, that seems to be a strong reframe in my perspective.
Yeah.
Taylor, let me just one quick comment about this. The way that a lot of people have gotten around or structured this conversation is through language that uses the term graduated responses. Graduated responses includes both accountability measures and reward or reinforcement measures. So if we can think of ways to sort of broaden our use of neurological and epigenetic approaches to habilitating or rehabilitating youth within this concept of what graduated response systems are in communities, families, schools, and so forth. I think that gets us where we need to get.
I think that's great. And I think maybe, would you say that the counterpart of that in psychology is shaping, the word shaping? So you kind of move them in the right direction by identifying intermediate milestones that lead to the right target.
Yes, but those milestones have to include prosocial as well, prosocial behavior, in addition to any consequences for problematic.
Yes, thank you. Great.
These are great ideas, and I encourage you guys to continue this discussion on Basecamp. You're more than welcome to start a new thread about this, but we do have to move on. In particular, the next thing that I want to ask from you guys is, what else do we want to know? So we know a little bit already about their current efforts and their areas of interest, but we kind of need to narrow their areas of focus and figure out how we can help them in sort of a more concrete way. So what kind of questions do you want me to ask?
Who are you going to ask, Taylor?
I'm going to refresh them on what we've discussed previously and ask them what has changed and how we might help them in the next few months.
The subcommittee, Congressional subcommittee?
That will be one target audience, yes. Are there other questions that you guys think that I should ask, or other points of feedback that you think would be important to include in the next needs assessment?
Taylor, there is a question on the group chat that you might want to just share with the group, but it's kind of a question around specifically the major pieces of legislation that are moving in this policy area, and we have had some conversations about what that is in some contexts, but of course it is a moving target. Bobby also could speak to that for the group, but we want to be sensitive to the time. So Taylor, do you want to field that, or do you want to defer that to the next call?
Sure. How about, let me just go over the last slide, and whoever can stay on for a couple more minutes can. The last slide, I just wanted to note that we will have another webinar next week at the same time using the same conference call line. I also want to remind people to follow up with rapid response requests. I know that you guys have provided a ton of really good resources. Now I just want to go through a process of practicing how we boil those down into specific talking points. So if you provide a resource, what is the main point of that resource? Why should somebody read it? The event date, we are firming that up so that it will be held on the date that I requested you guys to block off in your calendars. And so the Monday will be used for the meeting day and the reception. Tuesday, we will debrief together over breakfast, and there's another separate congressional briefing that will be held that afternoon if you want to stick around for that. The last thing is that I'm always looking for more feedback on our processes, and since we're running out of time to talk here, please email me. Just let me know if there's things that you think that I could be doing better to support you guys, or even process feedback on these rapid responses, because I want to make sure that this is a useful process for everyone, and I'm not asking too much of you guys. So with that, if you guys got to go, let me know. Go ahead and get off. But otherwise, if we can we follow up with a little bit more discussion on the relevant legislation that Max brought up?
Yeah, I'm happy to stay on and learn about it too.
And just a reminder to everyone, we are recording this and we will post it. So for those of you who do have to jump off, Taylor will give some background, and then you can go on and listen to it.
Sorry, can I ask one more question or bring up another? And we may have talked about this, but I think another area, because we're talking a lot about behaviors and impulsivity and outcomes, but in terms of knowing right and wrong, there is also a maturational aspect to things that people consider morality or sociality. I mean, for example, very young kids, they have no understanding of what a bad behavior is from the other's perspective. So other aspects of cognitive development and maturation, I think, may also be very interesting to maybe inform them, because these are also aspects that certainly contribute to behavior, but in a more sort of indirect way, if you will, or less visible way.
Absolutely. I think that that would be relevant to share in that request for information also, is maturation of decision-making processes, for sure. And so the relevant legislation, I don't have the chat window up, and maybe if I take my, stop sharing my screen, then I can see more of this information we have on the chat screen. But let's see. So Max, do you want to reiterate the question that someone had about the different relevant legislation?
Sure. I think it was in response to, kind of what we want to follow up with in the needs assessment, but also just this general question of, so what are the major pieces of legislation that's moving forward in this specific policy area so that the group can be aware of it. And I will just say that, our plan is towards the end of these sessions, we will be speaking about that more directly, but also, I guess, Michelle, you made asked the questions that you would normally ask, kind of, I guess, the staff, what is your boss's priorities featuring like this specific reauthorization? Taylor, can you kind of speak to that at all? Just so give people a taste, I guess.
So major legislation includes things like the Juvenile Justice Reauthorization of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, which is actually not in the House Judiciary Committee, but instead is in Education and Workforce Committee, because it pertains to things that involve prevention, as in we're doing things that help reduce the likelihood someone comes in contact with juvenile justice systems, and therefore jurisdictionally that doesn't make sense to be in the Judiciary Committee, where they focus on court processes, incarceration processes, and rehabilitation and reducing recidivism. So that's one piece. And then I've mentioned Every Student Succeeds Act is another piece. And that's something that focuses largely on reforming testing, but also involves reforming or providing support for schools that want to have more effective discipline practices, non-exclusionary discipline practices. And so I really like your suggestion, Michelle. What would your boss's priority be for this reauthorization? Because I think that that's direct and allows for a specific response on how we might frame our involvement, because at the end of the day, these staffers are working for a person that's who we're tailoring our response to as their needs. Did I answer your question? I think that there's a couple of other pieces of legislation, including juvenile authorization, juvenile accountability block grants program, and Robin Jenkins has been involved in some discussions regarding that, and I'm not really sure. There seems to be different perceptions of whether or not that program should be renewed, revamped, or scrapped altogether. So still trying to navigate that as well, because going into different offices, I'm not really always confident of what their perception on that program will be. And that one is in the House Judiciary Committee. There's also the Youth Promise Act, and Bobby Vassar can speak more to that. I am not sure if the Youth Promise Act has taken a back burner because of the JJDPA reauthorization. To me, it sounds like the JJDPA reauthorization has some common elements, and there's been more movement in the Senate to get that through. I don't think that means that the Youth Promise Act won't, that it will not move anywhere if JDDPA passes, but right now it's a matter of prioritization. So, Bobby, do you have any comments on that, or Robin? If they are on, they might have been gone.
Well, I'm still here. Bobby sent a chat note that he had to jump off.
Oh, no worries.
So what was the question again? I'm sorry.
So I guess in terms of relevant legislation, what's happening right now, like JBIG is something that it sounds like there's different perceptions of whether or not we should revamp that program, renew that program, or scrap it altogether. Do you have a sense of other things that we should be considering in terms of relevant legislation that's sort of current right now?
Well, I mean, if we're only talking about juvenile justice, the sort of the big 3 or 4 are the JJDP reauthorization. I think the Senate and Chairman Grassley and Senator Whitehouse saw that as a potential, because there was such consensus on the Senate side, they saw that as something that could be done quickly. And so they got with the advocates and made some changes, but it essentially is a very similar bill than it was during its last full reauthorization, which was over a decade ago. So over in the House, it's more complicated because Bobby Vassar and Bobby Scott have put extraordinary resources into that Youth Promise Act. And Youth Promise Act is sort of a bigger, better, more expanded, and more prevention-oriented JJDPA.
Right.
And so a lot of conversation has to come about as to whether you want to spend your political capital on one or the other, or is there a way to combine the optimal intents of both of those bills into some sort of merged product. So there's a lot that has to happen on the House side. On the JBIG conversation, the Juvenile Academy Block Grant, that piece of legislation has favor in the House, very similar to what I just said about the Senate. There are a lot of conservatives in the House that see that as a movable, winnable piece of legislation. It has a lot of accountability in it. But it had some detrimental impacts the way it got rolled out when it's been used over the last decade. And so, as Taylor's talking about, you know, does it need to be revamped, maybe scrapped altogether, or can you just sort of tweak it and move it along in its current status? Those are the questions. Same format, but have some inadvertent consequences of more school resource officers and locking up kids and more militarization of police forces. So those are some big ticket items that need consideration in these kinds of conversations.
Yeah. Right. Well, I know that I have to jump off. I'm sorry that I can't continue this great discussion. I saw that there was a question about how we can move more conversations onto Basecamp. I'll resend the invitations to join the Basecamp group if you're not already on it. But basically, all you have to do is log on, click start a new discussion, and you can email it to everyone, or you can select off of it depending on who you're trying to address. And if for some reason there's a discussion where you're getting inundated in emails and don't want any more, then you can go in your email, and at the very bottom of every Basecamp email thread is an option to take yourself out of a particular discussion. Okay? Well, thank you guys all for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to continuing these discussions because these are all very helpful, and I think that they're all very informative to our processes. All right. You guys take care.
Bye, everyone.